Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Waymond, and I'm happy to have you here today with me. Today, we're going to be using the Cameo 5 and making this stenciled lotus card. So, stenciling is one of the things that I really like about using my silhouette machine. And you can actually do this with a portrait, anything smaller or larger. Any silhouette cutting machine is going to work with the stencil material. But one of the things I like about stencils is that you're kind of blocking off all this extra area. And so you can kind of pretend like you're an artist, and you can't color outside the lines because the plastic is blocking that off. So it's also a fun craft for kids. I've had my kids paint Valentines, little hearts that have cutouts that they can do little Valentines, and just hand painted anything is really fun. And I'll talk a little bit about what you can use for stencils to kind of do the same technique with whatever design you want. But that's what we're doing. And let me talk about the supplies and things we're using. So I've got a Cameo 5, and as I mentioned, you can also use a portrait. You can use an old Cameo, an old portrait. You can use the Cameo Pro. Anything, any silhouette cutter, a Curio 2 will also work. So the size doesn't matter because we're working with adhesive stencil sheets. So this is the stencil material I'm using. This is the Silhouette brand, but there are other types of stencil material you can use. So this one, it's pretty thick, pretty sturdy, and that's why it's a good material. And it's a sticker backing, so it's easy to just cut it out and it'll stick right to your design. And I just really like it. We've also got a non-adhesive stencil material. That's not going to work so good because we're using wet paints. If you were to use something else like a dry sponge dauber with ink on it, that might be okay if you're using a non-adhesive stencil sheet. But for the wet media, any type of paint, you're going to want to use the adhesive stencil sheets. We're using a cutting mat. I've got both, because this is a card, I've got both cardstock and watercolor paper. So cardstock, you're just gonna want to choose at least 65-pound, but something heavier, maybe 80-pound would be a little bit better just because it's for the card base. I've already trimmed this down to 10 inches by 5 inches for my project, but basically whatever size you end up doing your page, your little decoration to stick on the card, you can just add a 1/2 inch, and that will be a good border. The watercolor paper, this one is a 90-pound, kind of a medium weight. So you can go with heavier, you just have to cut it deeper, but this 90-pound works great, and this comes in lots of different sizes. So really any watercolor paper you've got should work okay for this project. And then kind of miscellaneous things, we've got a paintbrush. This is a number 12, I think that's called a round. Whatever paintbrush you've got is probably fine. I'm using, for my weeding, I've actually got some needle tip tweezers. These are really sharp and they're sturdy. It's a little bit easier than a hook tool for me with this thicker material. I've got some paper towels. I do have some adhesive so I can stick it onto my card base when I'm done. You'll need a cup of water, of course, if you're using watercolors. And I think that's mostly it. I am using a cutting mat, although this has a backing on it, so you don't have to use a cutting mat. I'm just used to a cutting mat, so I'm using it. So this stencil material is, like I mentioned, it's thick. The reason I like this is because it can also be reused. So if you're using an appropriate stencil design, you don't have all these little different pieces that have to be placed and positioned separately. You're just doing one cutout. It's all in one sheet. And this thick one can actually be reused. So I've used my little sample here I've already used this 3 times and it's still really sticky on the back, and it's just thick, and I can just rinse it under the sink, just running water when I'm done, and let it air dry. If you use vinyl, you absolutely can do this project just with vinyl, just an adhesive vinyl, and that'll be a one-time use. And you might, with the watercolors, you might get a little bit more of, you'll see when I'm actually painting, but if it's really thin vinyl, you might get a little bit of overflow from one color into one spot from the next. So this thicker one, it's reusable, and it'll kind of protect your design a little bit more, but regular vinyl should also work okay if that's what you've got. All right, so let me make sure. Yeah, and I talked about you don't have to use watercolor. You can use like ink, a stamp pad, just a foam dauber, I think it's called. You just tap it on your stamp pad and tap it on the stencil. That'll work also. Okay, so if we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and move into the software. Okay, so here I am in Silhouette Studio. I am using Silhouette Studio version 5. So if you're not familiar with it yet, you'll get a little bit of a good look at it today. So what we're going to do, make sure that you have purchased your design, this Lotus Flower design, and you don't have to use that. Let me look in my library. So this is, I'm just going to type in Lotus in my search bar and we'll find that. So this is the one I'm using today, Lotus Flower Stencil. It's design ID 1254838. And you can use different types of stencils. This one, it's a little bit hard to tell just by looking at it, but what you're looking for is something that has all of the white space is connected. So we're going to be weeding out this colored space, and all the white space when you're working with a stencil needs to be connected. So one of these things when you're looking for designs in the design store is you can just type the word stencil, and I'm just in my library, but you can see I've bought quite a few stencil designs. So that will, it'll give you designs that like already have a box around it. Or it can bring up things like this butterfly stencil. Again, this one, all the white space is connected. So that's what you're looking for when you're doing a stencil design. So let's go ahead and open this, double click my Lotus Flower Stencil. Okay, and so that, I'm actually going to move that off to the side for a minute. Let's go ahead and create our card base pieces. So if you're using cardstock, I don't know if you're using media size or letter size or 12 by 12, but basically we can turn on the grid. So I'm in my page setup panel, so this upper left corner, and I'm going to check the box for show grid, and I want the box checked for snap to grid. And what that's going to do is let me draw a perfect square or rectangle that's going to snap to these grid marks. So you can expand this to look at your grid settings. And let's see, I like my divisions at 1. And my spacing, I'm usually going a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch. Okay, so over here on the left, I'm going to grab my draw a rectangle, and I'm going to draw a 10-inch by 5-inch rectangle. So you can kind of watch. I'm going to go down. You can watch on the left side, you can see those numbers change, and on the bottom. So on the left it says 10 inches and on the bottom it says 5 inches. And by having my snap to grid turned on, that makes it really easy to draw a quick rectangle. If you don't have snap to grid turned on, then you just need to go in and adjust the size of your rectangle. So that's my base. And then my card front that I'm going to apply the stencil to, I'm going to go 4.5 by 4.5. So again, just drag it out. So both sides say 4.5 and 4.5. All right, and now I'm going to turn off that snap to grid because when I'm not actually drawing, it kind of gets in the way. It can be a little nuisance. So if you have that snap to grid and things are jumping around where you don't want them, not being smooth, you can make sure that snap to grid is not checked. And then I've also turned off the show grid. Okay, so here's my base that can just be folded in half after I cut it. And then here's my reference rectangle. This is the size that I need my design to fit into. So now I've got my Lotus design, and I'm just going to resize it to fit in this square. And I want it to be about 4 inches wide. So I'm dragging the corner handle for 4 inches on one of the dimensions. I don't want it to get too close to my edges because then that just looks too crowded. All right, I'm going to go for 4 inches wide. All right, and then if I were to select those together and choose center, I can see what that's going to look like on my card. So if that looks too tight, you can make it a little, continue to resize it a little smaller, but I think that looks good. So now I'm going to move over this rectangle again off of my cutting mat, and I am going to just work with my Lotus now. So now is when we need to actually turn this into a stencil. If I were to cut this out right now, we don't know where the border is. It would just be the page itself. So I'm going to use my rectangle tool again. And I want to give about an inch on all sides as a border. So when I'm painting, I don't have that paint. As I get close to the edge, it doesn't go over across that border. So this one I want 6 inches by 6 inches. And I'm just going to hold my shift key. I've turned off my snap to grid, so I'm just going to get it pretty close. There's about 6 inches. And again, I'm going to select the two of those together and click center. This is on my quick access toolbar. And then I'm going to go ahead and group that. So if I want to move that, they stay together. All right, so let's go ahead and get this ready to cut. I want to make sure that my page is set up for my media, so and my machine. So I've got my machine as a Cameo 5, and feed type you can always leave it auto. Cutting mat, I'm using the 12 by 12 inch Cameo mat. And then my media size, since I'm using those stencil sheets, they are letter size. So I'm going to choose letter, and then I want to make sure that it's a portrait orientation. So it looks, when I load this into my machine, it looks the same on my virtual mat as it does on my real mat. Okay, so that stencil design is ready. So let's go ahead and go to the Send tab. And here's where I make sure that I am connected to my machine. The first time you open this, it will probably go to guided mode. There's a tab for guide here in Silhouette Studio 5. And just make sure that it scans and finds your machine. And once it finds your machine, you can say connect, and then it will continue to guide you through all the steps. I already know what I'm doing, so I'm going to skip over to the standard tab. And here I've got it's connected. It's already checked my firmware. I'm using the pink machine, which, did you know you can rename your machines? It's pretty fun. And I still need to load my media, but we'll go ahead. I'm going to do tool holder 2. So or excuse me, tool holder 1, because I'm using the Autoblade. And then my media, it actually has stencil material in the options. So I'm going to scroll down until I find stencil material. And I have already tested this, but I'm going to show you how to do a test cut anyways, because you might be using a different brand. Your blade might be more dull than mine. Your machine might be just a little bit different. So it's good to do a test cut every time you do a new material. But for this, I'm leaving it at the default of force 33. Speed is 2 because it's kind of a thicker material. It's good to go with a slow speed when you're doing thicker materials. Blade depth of 3. And then I'm actually going to change my passes to 2 when I'm using thicker material. I like to do 2 passes, but of course we'll test this. So let's go ahead and stop that screen share and we'll get this loaded up. Okay, so I've got my cutting mat and I've got a sheet of stencil material. Take off my protective sheet. And like I said, you could load this straight into the machine. You would need to adjust your rollers smaller to fit the letter size media, but I just like using my cutting mat. So I've got my media placed the same way that it's on my virtual mat in the software. And I've got my rollers set to the full width for the cutting mat. And I'm just loading the left side of my mat to the left guideline and pressing the load button. Okay, and so now I'm going to screen share again. Okay, so now that I've loaded that, my machine says it's ready. You've got that little green ready indicator. And so I'm going to do generate a test shape. So I'm just going to click that button for generate a test shape. And then I'm going to move that little square and triangle off of my design somewhere else that I can try it out, where it's not going to affect my design. And I'm going to click send test. Now make sure that you have actually loaded your media before you click the send test. So my machine's just doing that little square and triangle. And I'm going to unload that. And what I'm looking for is for that outer square to come off really easily and leave the triangle behind. It's kind of hard on this thicker material. I feel like that's pretty good. So I've got the little square and the triangle. If it didn't cut all the way through, what you would then do is go through and like increase your force. You could increase if it's close, I would say increase your force first if you're really close on it cutting through. If you're way off, go ahead and increase your blade depth. If you are another thing you can do is add another pass. But I think that felt pretty good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and load this back up. And so once you've done the test shape, you can see how it has turned so it's not bold anymore. So you can just leave it alone and it won't cut right now, the only thing they'll cut when you click the main send button is all these red lines. But I like to remove my test shape. It's kind of a personal preference thing. So I'm just going to click remove test shape. And if you were to try another test, like adjust your settings and then want to test again, you would need to do that remove test shape, and then you could generate a new one. But for now, it is ready to go. So I'm going to click send, and we will send it. And that's actually going to take a few minutes because the design is doing a double pass and it's doing a slow speed. So if we have any questions, now would be a good time to ask questions in the chat, or you can tell me where you are tuning in from. I think what I'm also going to do right now while that's cutting is I'm going to cut my watercolor paper down to 4.5 inches. You can actually do this with the Silhouette machine. You would, since we drew those squares to begin with, that's not just for reference. You can actually use your machine to cut these. I'm just going to use a paper trimmer right now. Paper trimmer while we have some time. So this was going to be 4.5 by 4.5 inches. Another nice thing about Silhouette machines is you can multitask, do more cutting. While you're waiting for the machine to do some cutting, you can do something else. All right, so that's my 4.5 inch square. All right, so I'm not seeing any comments. While we've got some time, I can show you this. Maybe this is actually just a full size sheet of letter paper cardstock. And so I cut this same design out of cardstock just to show that it works well in different sizes. So this would be really pretty if you even just took a sheet of watercolor paper and just did a big multicolor wash behind it. Then you could, maybe with a slightly bigger piece. Oh, there we go. You could actually do a solid color on top and glue that on there. And that's another fun way to use this design, or stencil design. The stencil designs are pretty versatile, and they just make things look, well, kind of professional. If you don't know how to watercolor, you wish you were a watercolor artist, like I wish I was. This is a great way to get around that. All right, we're still working through that. I think what I'm going to do while we wait for that is I'm going to go ahead and start painting and just show you how this goes, because I told you these are this is a reusable stencil. So I've already cut one out, and I'll show you how to weed that after it comes out. But just so we don't have to wait and have dead air time, let's go ahead and just use the one I've already cut out. So just peel it up off of the backing. It's got a nice glossy backing, so that can be reused and just stuck down there again. And there's my 4.5-inch square. So basically I'm just eyeballing this as I put it down, and it will come off if you put it down and you're not totally happy with it. But I've just kind of centered that. The only tricky one with this card, all of these are connected. These on the leaf, and you just make sure those are pushed down really well. Everything else should stick down pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna get some water. You could even do this with a water brush that has the reservoir. Well, that might actually almost be done. We're gonna paint this anyways. All right, so get your brush wet, and I'm just choosing, you can use any brand of watercolors, any type of watercolors. Kids watercolors work fine too. This, I'm just gonna kind of start filling in with a light coral pink. And you can decide how wet or dry you want that to be. But that, the borders of the stencil prevent that bleeding from one area to the next. So I don't want to get my pink onto the green leaves. But even if it did, it would be okay. That's kind of a watercolor look, right? All right, so I'm going to color both these flowers first with the light pink, and you can do this however you want. Whatever colors. Okay, and once I've got kind of that base pink down, then I'm going to go for another pink. It's kind of a medium pink. And a lot of these, if you just kind of dab your brush, if it's wet enough, it'll just kind of spread. So I'm just making sure basically that for me, since I don't really do watercolors, I wish I did for real. I'm just making sure I've got just a little bit of both colors in each section of this lotus, of each of the petals. And you can do it, you've got this stencil, you can do it the same way every time, or you can do it a little different every time. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow and green, I think, in the center of this one. And then I can start doing the green on the leaves. So you can see I'm not trying to be fancy and get my colors perfectly. I'm just making sure there's color in there, and the stencil takes care of all the borders for me. Okay, add just a little bit of dark. want some dark in here too. And just a little bit of yellow. Okay, so that is my extreme artistry in action. You can see how quick and easy that was. So let's go ahead and I'll let that dry and move my water far away. I'll spill it on my electronics. So while that is drying, I'm going to show you. Let's see if this actually cut through. Yep. I'm going to unload this. And I'm going to show you how we weed this. Now, if it doesn't cut through, you're going to need more of the weeding tool. But if it cut through well, then you don't need it too much. So if it's really sharp, you can just kind of stab and pull these pieces out. And because it's a stencil, we're actually removing the design. And you saw the reason for that, so we could fill it with color. But we're only leaving the border behind. So if you have a really good cut, those pieces are going to pop out really nicely. And if they didn't cut very well, that's when you need to, you can, with this thicker material, you can kind of bend and twist to get them to pop out because they've at least been scored. If you got a decent cut job but didn't go all the way through, you still are usually in pretty good shape that you can pull those, just kind of pop them out because you know where the score line is. But this one actually did really good. It's nice when it comes out this fast. Still no questions? Okay, we're weeding this while the original dries. Okay, here's one that didn't cut out quite as well. And so you can see that the edges I do get out, then I can just kind of get these off of my fingers. All right, so I've got some edges that did pop out well. So if I just kind of drag along where it at least scored, then it does still pull off cleanly. So that one was a good example of how you can get it to still weed away if it didn't get a super good cut. So as you're looking for your own stencil designs, sometimes you'll get to the end and you'll realize that there is like a piece inside this bigger piece. That's the kind of thing you want to avoid. You don't want any of these sections to have another piece inside of it that you would have to hand place. You can do that. It's just going to take extra time and isn't quite the ideal for a stencil. If you've ever tried doing letters as a stencil, like a letter O or a letter P where it has that center, You can actually go through in the software, and if you need to, you can create kind of a slice. So all of these were white on the white space on the design. And so if you need to like use your knife tool to cut through that and connect white to white, that will help you with a stencil, just to make sure that you don't have to hand place like your center of your O or your center of your P. That's kind of why I like to choose stencil as my search option when I'm looking for designs in the design store. All right, so that's my stencil. And you can see that when we pull this off, it all comes off in one piece. And like I said, you can store it back here when you're done on that page, and it can be reused. So let's see if it's still got a little bit of wet spots. So I'm going to speed things up with a blow dryer. As I clean up my little sticky bits. I also, when I was trying to get my practice pieces to dry, I blotted them with a paper towel. That wasn't as good because it kind of took some of the color away, so I like using a blow dryer better. I'm really close on that. Am going to use these couple little wet spots. Finish off with a paper towel. All right, so here is our stencil and our watercolor paper. We'll do a big reveal. So I'm just going to pull it away slowly. And you can see that just when it comes off in that one piece, just really slick. All right, there is the watercolor design. You can see that looks, because I use the same colors each time, it looks really similar to the other ones, but you could absolutely use different colors. And yeah, so this recording, if you go to YouTube, Michael's channel, and once you're on the Michael's YouTube channel, I will just type in silhouette or community classroom silhouette, and that'll bring up this class and any other free silhouette classes we've got. This stencil now has got a little bit of, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's got a little bit of paint left over. So all I do, because it's watercolor, I just run this under a faucet just running water, just let it rinse off. I'll rub it maybe a little bit with my fingers to get that, that color off. But then I will turn it upside down on a paper towel. So the sticky side is up, and I will just let that air dry for several hours before I use it again. Now, if you've got pets, you may want to keep it away from your pets. You don't want them to collect their fur on your air drying piece. Here is the 10-inch, or 10 inches by 5 inches. We could have created a perforated line, but I didn't. It still works. I will just fold that in half, and then usually use some type of folding tool or bone tool or whatever you have handy, like a paintbrush, to get that crease on there. And then we can just glue this on. So this, yeah, I think it's dry enough. I'm just going to use my adhesive. And that along there. And if it seems a little bit warped, like watercolor paper tends to do, you might try pressing it with an iron or something, just to get it to lay a little smoother. But when you've got that watercolor look, just that little bit of warping, it definitely looks more handmade. So you might want to have that look so people think that you're an amazing artist. All right, do we have any other questions? Hey, well, great. This, like I said, I just really like stencils and the stencil material to create your designs for watercolors, just because it just has those clean, crisp edges, and it just looks like you put a lot of work into it when you really didn't. So it's a good cheater method. It's a good for the kids. And if we don't have any other questions, I will say goodbye and thank you for being here today.